All right, I think we'll get started. Good evening. My name is Amy Buckler, and I'm a strategic projects manager in community planning and development for the City of Olympia. With me tonight is Leonard Bauer, our CP&D director, Carrie Retlin, our housing manager, Joyce Phillips, principal planner, and program assistants Anastasia Everett and Kenneth Hanner. All of us play a role in addressing housing issues for the City of Olympia, and we want to thank everyone for being here tonight. Housing is an important issue for our community, and as the city continues to address challenges that we face, we just really can't do that without your feedback and your support. So we really appreciate your engagement tonight. Before I go any further, I'm going to put my slides on. And I also would like to know a little bit about who you are. So Anastasia, can you please put on the first survey questions? Find out where people live and who they are.
So the polling questions are now up.
And I'll give just a moment for people to fill these out. I don't know if you can see how many people are responding, Anna.
Yes, I can. We are at, oh, it's fast, 29 of 50.
Okay, we'll give another moment for people to fill this survey questions out. And when it gets close to the total, maybe go ahead and show us the results.
Okay, so we're at 48 of 51, and I'm going to end the polling now. And I'm sharing the results with everyone.
All right, awesome. So we have a good mix from around the city and some folks from outside of Thurston County or other location within Thurston County. And good, 25% renters, 65% homeowners, and some folks who are landlords, builders, business owners. That's great. Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, so we'll go ahead and close that and move on. So I am going to talk for about 35 minutes this evening about our housing action plan. I'm going to highlight some key data about Olympia's housing needs and actions we can consider to address those needs. I'm also going to tell you how you can share your feedback on the housing action plan moving forward. Now, there is a lot to cover with housing. The purpose here tonight is really to talk about our housing action plan and help prepare you to be able to provide comments. I know that there are a lot of other housing questions in the community. I'm not going to cover those in my presentation tonight. You can ask the questions that you have, but I wanted to make sure that I reserved most of our time for your questions. Now, you can ask a question at any time during the presentation and the Q&A period. Where you're going to be able to do that is if you see the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and when you click that, it's going to open up this other window where you can type your question, and then you're going to want to make sure that you hit send. Now, I will apologize because I don't believe that we're going to be able to get to every question tonight. We will certainly try. We're not going to be able to answer questions in writing during this, but we will add a frequently asked question page to our housing action page on Engage Olympia following the event. You can also reach out to me, and I'm happy to talk to you if your question doesn't get answered. And you can find my contact information, and you can find the Engage Olympia page by either Googling it or a link to that from the city's homepage. So in 2019, the Washington State Legislature made grant funding available to cities to develop housing action plans. And the focus is on actions that the cities can take to increase housing supply types and affordability. In recognition of our shared housing market, the cities of Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater went after that grant together and decided to work on this project together along with help from Thurston Regional Planning Council. This is really an extension of ongoing work that each of the cities has been doing. This isn't the beginning or the end. This work is really helping us further develop our roadmap and grounding us in common baseline market and demographic data to inform our decisions. Something else I do want to be clear about is that the focus here is on permanent housing. This plan does not address emergency homeless response like temporary shelter, but we do recognize that housing is the ultimate solution to homelessness. So part of our aim is to make sure that we have the right amount and type of housing in order to address that need. Now, at this point in the project, we've completed several reports, which you can find on our Engage Olympia page in the document library. And one of these is a draft housing action plan that includes shared strategies and a menu of actions that the cities can take. At this point in the process, each one of the cities is carrying out their own public review process to tailor this draft to our individual needs. And per the grant, we need to do that and have our housing action plans adopted by the end of June. Now, it's really important that we have these shared strategies and shared understanding of our housing needs across 3 cities, but each one of the jurisdictions is a little different, so we may take some different actions. That said, we're going to continue to collaborate and identify joint actions where possible. So let's take a look at some of the key things that we learned from our housing needs assessment. Thurston County's population is growing, and about 65% of our population is going to live in Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater, and our urban growth areas. And those are the yellow areas on the map that will eventually be annexed into the cities. The projection for Olympia and our urban growth area is that our population will grow by about 20,000 people over the next 25 years. And to meet that need, Thurston Regional Planning Council projects that we'll need about 14,000 new housing units in Olympia by 2045. Now, this is a projection. It's based on current trends that could change. But at this point, what the projection is telling us is that we'll need about a 46% increase over our current housing stock by 2045. Not only are we growing, our demographics are changing. Our population is growing older. By 2045, 1 in 4 residents will be over the age of 65. Our average household size is getting smaller, and only about 1/3 of our households are what you might consider nuclear families or married couples with children. We have many more people that are living alone or with non-family members, single parents, households that don't have children, and 54% of our population are renters. This has been inching up over the years. Now, as I'm sure you are all aware, housing affordability is a serious issue for Olympia. Affordability is relative. The general rule of thumb, though, is that housing should not cost more than 30% of a household's income. But 47% of Olympia households do spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And that's what we call housing cost burdened. Our data also shows that the lower a household's income, the more likely they are to be housing cost burden. And this is a problem in our community because these households have less stability. They're less able to spend income on things like saving for retirement, healthcare, and education. We want to see the rate of cost burden go down as we continue to track our progress of our actions moving forward. Well, what does this mean looking out 25 years into the future? We can't really predict the rate of cost burden in the future, but we did do an income forecast as part of this work. Now, we are expecting about 30,000 more households in Lacey, Olympia, and Tumwater by 2045, and our projections show that nearly 1 in 2 of these new households will be of low income. So this certainly has implications for housing affordability and the actions that we take. The last key finding I'm going to share with you from our assessment is what the data says about race and ethnicity. We find that people of color in Thurston County generally have more people in their household, are less likely to own their own home, have smaller household incomes, and are more likely to experience homelessness than people who are white and non-Hispanic. Now, policies that were enacted by local government and the private sector have led to these housing inequities. And I'm talking about things like redlining or refusing financing or covenants on land use plats that exclude Black households from living in certain areas. And this definitely was happening here in Thurston County. So creating more affordable housing opportunities goes hand in hand with reducing these inequities. We don't have one action in our plan about equity. It's really an overarching theme. For every one of the strategies we ask, not only how does this address housing affordability, but how does this address equity? And that's really a start. We know that we have a lot more work to do moving forward to address the issue of inequity. So I'm going to pause here and have Anna put up another survey question. I'm wondering if any of the data that we just went over surprised you, or maybe you saw it recently if you were reviewing materials for this. And check all that apply.
So I have the survey up and we're just waiting for answers.
Are we getting close, Anna?
Yeah, we're about, they're still coming in pretty heavily.
Okay.
Right, so we're at about 40 and I'm gonna go ahead and end the polling now.
Wow, yeah. So that surprised me too. Over the next 25 years, a lot of people, 60% of the people were surprised that 1 in 2 households are projected to be low income. Thank you for sharing that with me. All right. So that was a very high level overview of some of the key stats from our housing needs assessment. And if you want to dig in more, I encourage you to check out the housing needs assessment report or our story map that are both at Engage Olympia. Taking in everything that we learned, the 3 cities identified the following 7 housing needs to guide our actions. We need to reduce the cost of housing for low income and cost burdened households, increase the inventory of housing for all households, increase the variety of housing sizes and types, and the stock of housing options for aging seniors. We need to maintain our existing housing stock. Now, that's one of the most important things we can do to preserve housing that's already affordable in the community, increasing household wealth by providing safe and stable options for rental housing and pathways to ownership, and increase permanent housing options for people with disabilities and those at risk of experiencing homelessness. Now, when we talk about taking action to address these needs, what does that even mean? First of all, the city does not control the housing market. We can't control the cost of building materials or financing or whether a property owner wants to sell a piece of property, but we can influence the housing market through our policies, regulations, investments, and partnerships. We do planning, we engage the public, and we advocate at the legislative level for state and federal action. So when we're talking about taking action, we're talking about doing things that fall within these roles. I really want to be forthright with all of you that this plan is not going to solve housing affordability for Olympia. This is a roadmap for city actions that can make a difference. But to really solve the affordability crisis, it's going to take actions across the entire industry. A few other notes on the actions, as we were working with Lacey and Tumwater to identify what actions we can take, we were looking at what other cities have done. We're looking at the tools that are available to us in the city of Washington. It became apparent that Olympia is really doing a lot and has done a lot, particularly in the past few years. We adopted a home fund. We adopted housing code options to allow more housing types in our neighborhoods. We've made it easier to build accessory dwelling units. In fact, of the actions identified in the draft plan, Olympia has already implemented about 1/3 of these to some degree. Can we do more? Absolutely. We have a slate of housing actions on our work plan already for this year. So for those of you that are worried that we might be stopping to plan while action really needs to be taken, we're always planning and acting. And I'm going to highlight some of the things that are underway or under consideration already this year. Another thing is, we don't have to decide a strict yes or no on whether we want to take all of these actions by June. Most of these are going to require separate decision-making processes, sometimes with a public hearing, as would be the case with any land use development codes. So at this stage, we're just developing our roadmap. What actions should we consider next? And how should we be thinking about these things? What's important to you? I fully expect that there'll be other actions that, may come into our, sites. We're following the legislative session closely. We're looking for new opportunities. And lastly, the thing is, I wanted to tell you that an important part of this project is to establish that baseline data with the housing needs assessment, because we are going to be continually monitoring trends and performance to help inform our actions moving forward. So there are some actions that might not make sense to do now, but will make sense at some point in the future as conditions change. This work is also going to inform an update to our comprehensive plan housing element, and that's our overarching goal and policy document that helps us plan for growth and guides everything the city does. It's a really important part of the comp plan are our community vision and goals. And so I've pulled out some of these vision and goals from the plan that relate to housing to reflect back to you. So we want affordable housing for all income levels, housing located close to shopping and employment, variety of options to support people with different lifestyles, compact growth pattern that supports walking, mobility devices, biking and transit, environmental protection, climate change adaptation, cultural and historic preservation, and urban design that maintains or improves established neighborhoods. So when we talk about taking action for housing, we're not losing sight of these other considerations. Every time we take an action, we have to think about how we maximize and balance these goals. And I also mentioned that our land use regulations are also guided by these goals. The Draft Housing Action Plan identifies 6 strategies for addressing housing needs. And then we've organized over 50 potential actions underneath these strategies. So these are increasing the supply of permanently affordable housing for households that make 80% or less of the area median income, that would be low income, establishing a permanent source of funding for low income housing, expanding the overall housing supply by making it easier to build all types of housing projects, increasing the variety of housing choices, making it easier for households to access housing and stay housed, and continually building on resources, collaboration, and public understanding to improve implementation of housing strategies. I want to stress that all of these are important. Sometimes in conversations, I hear it framed as if we need to make a choice between increasing the supply of low-income housing or just increasing the supply of market rate housing. It's both and, not either or. If we're going to meet our housing needs for this growing community, all of these strategies are important. Now, as I mentioned, we identified over 50 actions. I'm only going to hit a few highlights. The first 2 strategies on here are obviously really important now and into the future, but how do we increase the supply of low-income housing? Well, first, we recognize that there are different strategies needed for different income levels, as this chart demonstrates. You can see along the bottom, household income categories divided up by percentage of area median income. That's a common way of breaking out income levels in the housing world. And going up is the level of support needed to provide housing for people at that income level. Now, the private sector is going to build most of the housing that we need, and they're able to do that really effectively at this end of the chart. And in some cases, here in the middle between the 50 and 80 AMI, and some of our strategies are intended to help boost the private sector to be able to build housing there. But housing for very low and extremely low income households down here at this end of the chart, typically requires pretty significant support from government and nonprofits. And I'm going to share some examples with you. So under construction currently is 2828 Martin Way. This is permanent supportive housing, housing with wraparound services for households experiencing homelessness. And building new housing for households at or below 50% of AMI requires deep subsidies. In this case, city, county, and state support all came into play, including 3 important tools where the city has already taken action to make these available to us, and that's our home fund. We donated the land, and we provided an 80% impact fee exemption for low-income housing. That's only available for low-income housing. And you can see this is a $20 million project. Our home fund does not cover all of those costs. It's seed money that helps these projects go after bigger dollars, particularly at the state level. The Washington State Housing Trust Fund and housing tax credits are the big funding sources here. This funding is competitive across the state, and we, along with other cities, are lobbying the state legislature to increase the trust fund budget. Moving forward, it's Olympia's goal to use our home fund to spur about 60 permanent supportive and affordable housing units a year. We did do a second award to the Family Support Center for a project on the west side. This year, we'll be doing a third home fund award. And so, that's a really important tool for us, as well as donating land and impact fee exemptions for helping reduce the cost of construction and making it more viable. Another example is Merritt Manor, which is new apartments on Martin Way. This has 80 units of affordable housing for people that make 80% or less of median income. And this project was actually built by a local private sector developer. A variety of city incentives for low-income housing and development were used here, along with private donations. And these are, again, really important tools that we want to keep in our toolbox for moving forward. It's typical for it to take multiple incentives or subsidies to make these projects feasible. And it's also the case that the same set of incentives won't necessarily work for every project or every type of project in every neighborhood. So we really want to have a range of tools available to us. One of the actions that we're going to be looking at this year is expanding the areas where the 12-year multifamily tax exemption can be used. This incentive provides a partial property tax exemption on the project for 12 years with an affordability requirement. Another form of subsidy that I want to touch on, and this is not really the city's business, but it's really important nonetheless, are housing vouchers. These are funded by the federal government and dispersed by our local housing authority. These agencies have really shifted away from public housing to using more housing vouchers, which subsidize the cost of rent so that tenants only pay 30% of their income. One of the reasons for this shift is that vouchers are just more cost efficient. And they also tend to disperse rather than centralize low-income housing in the community, which is really a best practice for building strong communities. Vouchers are how most low-income housing is done. And the new administration is talking about increasing voucher funding, which could help a lot of people. Right now, there's only enough funding to help about 25% of people who are eligible. That's both locally and nationally. But the thing that we need to be aware of as a community is that vouchers largely rely on units that are often built by the private sector being available. In addition to some of the tools that I've highlighted that Olympia already has in play and that we want to keep using, the draft plan identifies other actions that we can take to spur low-income housing development. Many of these involve funding and partnerships. So this could include helping nonprofits buy income-restricted units that are proposed to be converted to market rate, say when an affordability requirement is expiring, or help low-income housing developers expand homeownership opportunities. That could include working with land trusts or organizations like Habitat for Humanity and funding low-income housing projects in general. Now, we'll be looking for these opportunities, but to really scale up these partnership opportunities is going to require more resources, and ideally at a regional level. One way that this could happen is with a county-wide home fund. Of course, that would not be a decision by the City of Olympia. That would be a decision by the Thurston County Commissioners, and we would certainly support it. I'm a little curious to know if you would support a local public funding to increase the supply of permanently affordable housing. So we're going to put up this survey.
And we got some feedback on the last question that I ended the polling a little early, so I'm going to leave it open just a little longer.
No problem, thank you. And sorry about that.
All right, so it's been at 57 of 63 participants voting for a few seconds, so I'm going to go ahead and end the polling now.
68% definitely, 23% it depends, which I understand, 5% absolutely not, and some don't know. So, all right, well, thank you. Another potential action that's identified in the draft is requiring developers to include affordable units within new projects. As we've learned from other cities, this is something that we need to make sure we have the right conditions for. So if you have a strong and sustained housing market and a program that is flexible and structured with sufficient incentives to offset the affordability requirements, this is a tool that can increase affordability. But it can also have unintended consequences. If there are no incentives offered, or if incentives don't cover the gap between the below market rents and the market rate rents, then owners have to either decide whether they're going to raise the market rate rents or cancel the plans to develop the project altogether. And both of those things undermine affordability. The next step for the city on this question would be to conduct a feasibility analysis. And I would recommend that we approach this from the standpoint of what would it take? How can we make it feasible for low-income units to be included in multifamily housing on a bigger scale? And then we can go from there to decide whether or not it makes sense to require it. Just as important as increasing the supply of low-income housing is increasing the overall supply of housing. This is important for meeting the needs of our growing population and for affordability. When demand for housing is high, but supply remains low, which is the circumstance we have right now, what we see is housing costs increase for renters and potential buyers across the board. I do understand the concerns in the community when you see market rate housing being built that's not affordable to half of our community. We just need to understand that increasing the supply of new market rate housing is going to play a role in stabilizing home prices across the board. Not a panacea. Like I said before, all of the strategies are important. Here locally in Olympia, the number of units that we're permitting will always vary from year to year. But on average, we permit about 370 units a year. And that's about 60% of what we ought to be producing moving forward. So making it a little easier to develop can help us get there. One of the factors leading to underproduction of housing throughout Washington are layered and complex regulations that increase the costs and risks and uncertainty of development and can ultimately suppress the development of housing. We've seen this impact both the private sector and our nonprofit housing developers, and there are some things that we can do. So our council's land use committee has already asked city staff to review our fees and regulations to identify areas where changes could reduce barriers to housing construction. So we're going through that review this year. We can also make it easier to do upgrades without triggering a host of requirements, and of course, where we can do that safely. And one of the most impactful things we can do is reduce our parking requirements in areas where there is frequent transit. And that's because parking is expensive to build and it reduces the amount of land that can be devoted to actual housing. I know that there may be concerns about reducing parking requirements or really any of these actions. And I really want to be clear that we are not proposing some kind of massive deregulation. We started out by referencing our community vision, which will continue to guide our land use development. We just want to recognize that reducing costs and complexity of development is one area where the city really does have some direct influence. And so it's important for us to consider how we might do that. And I think there's a smart way to go about that, a smart way to think about how we're going to balance our goals. The parking requirements and reducing those is one good example. We have a lot of goals in our comprehensive plan about reducing dependence on the automobile and promoting walking, biking, and transit. So when we think about reducing parking requirements in areas where there is frequent transit, that may be one area where we're, as a community, willing to accept that trade-off in order to get more housing built. Some other potential actions, and I put this map up for context. Our comprehensive plan identifies 3 areas where we are planning for a significant amount of housing growth. And that would be here by the Capitol Mall Triangle, downtown, and the Pacific Martin Way Triangle on the east side. And we've done some work with downtown through the downtown strategy. I think we have some more work to do on the affordability side. We are seeing more housing being built since then. Next, we'd like to take a look at the Capitol Mall area. This is where we have a really good opportunity to create a more active urban node that's pedestrian friendly with a mix of housing and businesses and a mix of incomes. But to make that a reality is going to take some rethinking and retooling of our regulations and investments. Several of the actions that are proposed in the draft plan could be used here. One is doing a SEPA planned action. This would be an upfront review and analysis of environmental impacts, and this can help streamline the process for development. A plan for adapting vacant commercial space to housing, strategic infrastructure investments, particularly in this area, probably transportation, form-based code, and then I think we would also want to include the low-income housing actions that we spoke about earlier. There's a lot of concern in the community about tenant stability and displacement, and for good reason. Involuntarily losing one's home can be destabilizing and lead to long-term poverty and homelessness. We really do not want to see that happen to anyone in our community. While the city can't control every aspect that leads to these situations, there are things that cities can do to minimize the impacts. This year, we're exploring possible tenant protections. This will involve public engagement to gather feedback from both renters and landlords. Some other things on the list include tenant opportunity to purchase ordinance, which would give tenants the first right to purchase property if it's going up for sale, and requiring developers to provide relocation assistance if tenants are being displaced due to redevelopment. As we saw in the needs analysis, increasing the variety of housing choices is important because our demographics are changing. City recently amended our development code to allow more housing options in neighborhoods, and we adopted more flexible codes and pre-approved plan sets for accessory dwelling units. Those are some of the strongest things that we could do in this category, but we've also identified some other actions like allowing single room occupancies in all of our multifamily zones and allowing more housing types in commercial zones are things that we can take a look at. So I'm going to wrap this up so that we can get to your questions. You can learn more about the actions at Engage Olympia by looking at the Draft Housing Action Plan. There's also a document there called Draft Recommended Actions for Olympia. And we want to learn more from you. What do you think about these strategies and potential actions, and how do you think that we should be thinking about these? What other action ideas do you have? So I love to hear from you. You can contact me at any time. My email is up on the slide. The first time, I think, that I'm announcing the public hearing at the Planning Commission, or the Planning Commission will hold a public hearing on the Housing Action Plan on May 17th at 6:30 p.m. So this will be virtual, which you'll have an opportunity to speak, or you can submit written comments. Any comments that I receive between now and May 17th, I will provide to the Planning Commission and also to the City Council when they consider the Housing Action Plan in June. I'll also share with them the results of the housing survey that just closed. We're working on the results right now. So now it's time for Q&A. I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what they do for the city. In a minute, I will turn off the slides, but I'll leave this how to pose your question up for just a moment, and then I'll turn it off. So we'll start with Leonard.
Hello, everyone. My name is Leonard Bauer. I'm the Director of Community Planning and Development Department at the City of Olympia.
Good afternoon. I'm Kerry Retlin. I manage housing programs and the Home Fund for City of Olympia.
And I'm Joyce Phillips. I'm one of the land use planners for community planning and development, and I will be asking the questions to our panelists this evening.
All right, let me turn this off and then let's roll with the questions. It looks like we've had a number of questions, so that's good.
Great. So Amy, one of the first questions that came in had to do with what does AMI stand for? So if you could please describe that again and how it relates to housing.
Yeah, so it's area median income, and it's a benchmark that's used by the federal government and many housing programs as, to establish if you're lower than area median income, and the ranges of incomes below that would be considered low income, or you're right at the median.
Excellent. And is there recent data that's accessible to show what the AMI is for this area?
Yes, actually, I'll turn my slides back on and I can share that with you. Okay, I think we'll start with this. Does this have it? Maybe not. Well, the area median income for Thurston County, and this is area median family income, is about $86,000 for a family of 4. And then if you break this down, there's it's kind of common to break out the affordability levels by 30% or less, and here it's 33 because we're showing that if you make minimum wage, you're actually a little above 30. 50% AMFI, 80% AMFI, and 100% AMFI. So you can see what the yearly income is at each one of these income levels and what you would need to make on an hourly basis to be considered at that level of income. And then if you want to go a little further, this chart also shows what your monthly rent or mortgage payment you can afford if you're paying 30% at those area median family income rates, and also what price of housing you can afford at 20% down or 10% down. So we have this chart or a similar chart in our story map, and it kind of goes into a little more explanation about the type of jobs that may make these area median incomes, and just talking about how difficult it is. If you look at right now for Thurston County, average rent, and this is just taken off of something like Zillow, and then median home sale price, which is provided to us by the Realtors Association. And you can compare that to what people in our community at these various income levels can actually afford. You can see that for people in the extremely and very low income ranges here, it's very difficult. I mean, at this point, they're priced out of the market largely. And then, if you look at 80% AMFI, Even though it says, well, you could, afford a home for $480,000, so maybe you could afford median home sale price. I think we need to keep in mind how difficult it is to actually save up for a down payment. And that's really a barrier to a lot of people, to first-time home buyers, to entering the market.
Great, thank you. And a follow-up question along the same lines is, so if that's the case, why are houses or apartments going for $2,000 to $300 or $3,000 a month for renters? Which I think is probably kind of part of the issue we're trying to solve here today.
Right. So one of the reasons why housing prices are going up across the board is because of the lack of supply. When people who are renting that would otherwise like to purchase a home can't, then they're going to stay renting longer, which also, creates lower vacancy rates for those apartments because they're staying in the apartments. So if housing supply is limited, those prices are going up. If multifamily production is limited and people who would otherwise want to, purchase a home can't, then apartment prices are getting even more limited. And that is the main reason why housing costs are rising across the board. There are some other reasons. We've seen building construction material costs rising quite a bit recently. But I also wanted to share with you, we did just do an analysis of rental costs for new apartments for studios, single or 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom apartments in Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater. And the prices are across the board in all 3 cities, fairly comparable. It just kind of depends on the development, but you can see, these prices from March here for Olympia, Lacey. We didn't have any studios in Tumwater, averaging around $1,300. For 1-bedrooms, these are all new apartment complexes. You can see, Franklin Lofts and Olympia's downtown, $1,300, and prices going up. Tumwater, $1,400, downtown, Lacey, $1,400, Briggs Village in Olympia, Martingale and Lacey, $1,600, and then of course 2 bedrooms. So part of why I wanted to show you that is just to address, this isn't just happening in downtown Olympia. It's not happening in one place. This is happening across the board in Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater.
Great. Leonard or Carrie, did you have anything you wanted to add before I pose the next question? Okay. Are the tenant opportunity to purchase ordinances optional participation for the builder or property owner?
Well, we are just getting into that conversation. So we have a group of local housing affordability advocates that is going to be briefing our land use committee on this in April. And they are proposing that it be mandatory. But they're really just going to be providing a briefing for how they think it could be used in Olympia. It may not be the same recommendation that Olympia staff would ultimately make. We're at the very beginning of this conversation. So right now, we just want to decide whether we want to put tenant opportunity to purchase on our work plan for future consideration. And we'll go through the process of engaging with the community and doing some more research to find out what we think should be recommended and whether it should be voluntary or optional, or what kind of housing it should be applied for.
Great. So we have a question that came in around senior housing. It's still expensive, even shag housing is expensive, and the rates are apparently based on Seattle home prices. Is there more that will be done for the elderly or disabled people or even young families? And how will this proposal address some of those concerns?
Well, we talked about some of the actions that we can take to increase the supply of low-income housing, forming partnerships, helping to fund, providing incentives to help the private sector build lower-income housing. Certainly, that's an issue for seniors. Many seniors are on fixed incomes like Social Security. So, you know, as we think about that, some of the ways that, or some of the tools that we have available to help with low-income housing we talked about, but there's also some additional tools on the books that can help with senior housing projects. There's an exemption from school impact fees. There's also a way to help reduce transportation impact fees by using an alternative calculation allowance. There are options for helping seniors reduce the cost of their housing available in the community. The City of Olympia offers a utility rate discount for low-income seniors. Thurston County has a property tax reduction for low-income seniors. You know, something else that that I've learned is that according to the AARP, about 75% of seniors nationally say that they want to age in place or remain in their long-term homes. It can help with housing affordability over time because, you know, maybe the mortgage is paid off. There are some opportunities in the community if a senior can afford it. Maybe they can tap their home equity and build an accessory dwelling unit and have that rental income help with the cost of their mortgage. Senior Services of South Sound has a home share program where they match seniors with someone who needs a place to rent. Also, there are some things that can be done to help seniors with upgrades as they age with things like ramps or essential home repairs to make it possible for them to age in place. And another reason why this can help with housing affordability is that if there is a need for some kind of long-term care in the later stages of life, that's going to be a lot cheaper for that to come to your own home than to be in another housing facility. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about when it comes to senior housing. I don't know if anyone has anything to add.
Maybe I'd just add that Joyce mentioned SHAG. So we have some apartments in Olympia and other places in Thurston County that have rent limits. Many of those, so I know the apartments, the Boardwalk apartments, for example, downtown, most of their rent limits are around 60% of area median income, which for a family of one is around, well, at 50% AMI, that's $30,000, $3,350 a year. And for a family of two, it's $34,700. So that's an example of what rent limits are at a project like SHAG.
I might add one other point. It's not specific to seniors or singles or small families or young families, but it is probably most helpful there and can help others as well. And that is, we've talked in this housing action plan about the combined cost of housing and transportation. Often kind of a rule of thumb that's used nationally on that is, you know, Amy mentioned earlier, housing costs being 30% of income. The combined housing and transportation costs are often expected to be targeted around 45% of income. So some of the activities that we're doing in terms of centralizing some of these subsidies or incentives for development are along our corridors, our frequent transit corridors in Olympia, which would be Martin Way, Pacific Avenue, State and 4th, of course, and then Harrison and headed out to the west to Mud Bay. Those are places we'd like to try to help locate many of these types of housing so that the transportation costs can be much less with those frequent transit corridors as well. And then that can result in that transportation money that would normally be spent on that to be able to be used for other essentials for living. And so hopefully that's also particularly helpful to seniors and young families as well.
And that also raises another question that came in earlier. What do you consider to be frequent transit?
15 minutes, isn't it?
Yeah, I think intercity transit targets 15 minutes. Again, that's kind of a national standard, 15 minutes or less. That, you know, so if you're walking out to a bus stop, you would not have to wait more than 15 minutes for a bus to come by. And the free service that intercity transit started pre-pandemic is along those main corridors is not only every 15 minutes, but it is free and there's no cost. So that's a real advantage we have in our area for transit.
Okay, this one pulls in several different issues, but it says if the city would like to increase construction, why not just reduce the impact fees and eliminate the sprinkler system requirement? More supply would help keep rents down. $40,000 for permits and impact fees is the main reason no one is building. So just how do you believe that these housing strategies would respond to the issues around impact fees and the cost of construction for permits?
So we do hear about impact fees a lot. Now, a lot of times people are including impact fees as well as sewer hookup fees, including lots, capital facilities charge or capital development charge for hooking into lots sewer system. That's actually one of the largest fees that a developer pays per unit, and not in our control, but something that I understand LOT is looking at. You know, impact fees help us pay for our investments and our improvements in transportations, parks, and schools. And the impact fee is based on when we look at, you know, what are our plans and goals for parks and transportation. We actually don't control the school impact fees. That's the schools. But it looks at, you know, what do we want to accomplish with our plans? And then it, you know, looks at what's our housing projection and, you know, divides up and determines the impact fee based on that. When we are looking at something like our transportation master plan and we're thinking about how are we going to pay for all of these transportation needs that we have really limited funding for that. And the impact fees are an important part of that funding. So, you know, at this moment in time, I wouldn't recommend, for example, that we lower our transportation impact fees. There's so many goals in our comprehensive plan about making improvements to get more sidewalks and bicycle lanes and making sure that we, you know, people have access to those types of amenities so that we can create the types of neighborhoods that we want. And our transportation impact fee is actually fairly comparable to our neighboring jurisdictions. It's similar with our park impact fee. I don't know if Leonard has anything that he wants to add, but I guess I would just close by saying, I think there are some other things that we can look at to reduce costs and complexity, but I'm not sure the impact fees right now are the right ones.
So, yeah, I would add a little bit. I mean, essentially, put very simply, as Amy was saying, it's the charges are for the impact that development is having on transportation or parks or schools. So the capacity of those facilities needs to be paid for one way or the other. If it's not through an impact fee for the development that's causing the impact, then it will be a more broad cost to the entire community. And that's a policy decision, of course, that our city council has to make and has made, that you know, an impact fee is appropriate for that development to pay for its impact on what is needed for more transportation or schools or park facilities. There is, as we mentioned earlier, another policy decision that was made to provide a reduction for affordable housing affordable to 80% or lower of median income, because of the benefit that does provide. Those developments provide that affordable housing. And so the agreement was that the city would cover that difference in the impact. There's also some evidence that there's maybe less impact on some of our facilities, transportation particularly, from that type of development, as people maybe own cars fewer and use transit more. So that's another part of that decision. But that, I know there was a question in the Q&A also about why are we providing that that low income affordable housing impact fee exemption, and that's the reasoning behind that for that particular purpose.
Well, great. That was my follow-up question was, you know, who pays for those needs when there are exemptions, and you covered that. So let's see, we've got a lot of questions coming in here. Several of the questions have to do with the multifamily tax exemption. And so what some of them think that it's ineffective or perhaps not a useful tool or perhaps at the taxpayer's expense. And then some people want to know just more about the multifamily tax exemption program in general. Leonard, is that a question you think you could respond to?
Well, I might take a quick start, but it really carries the manager of that program and much more knowledgeable. But I'll just say that, you know, that's a program the state legislature has authorized for several decades now. They've made some modifications to it over time, and the purpose originally was to provide housing opportunities and incentivize housing opportunities where that hasn't been happening through the regular market process. Later, the legislature adjusted that to add a 12-year tax exemption for housing that is affordable for that 12-year period and is documented and required to do so. So with that general purpose, Carrie, I'm sure, can add much more to the discussion of how we use it in Olympia.
So we have all cities who are using a multifamily tax exemption, and there's many cities up and down the I-5 corridor, as well as Spokane and other planning cities that are able to use the program have to designate a specific map. And so our map is really our downtown core right now, because for years that was an area where we wanted more housing. It was because of its access to transit, because we could have more dense housing in the downtown core. So the multifamily tax exemption has really helped us make progress in our comprehensive and other plan goals in developing that housing, specifically around the 8-year that Leonard was talking about, so the market rate. And one of the misconceptions, I think, is that market rate units are expensive. Amy had showed some data before about market rate units citywide or in specific parts of the city, and there were some multifamily tax exemption projects in there, and they were hanging with their peers. You know, so I know, like at 321 Legion, those units are renting for $1,098 a month for a studio, or $1,692 a month for a 2-bedroom, which is really in that same average neighborhood as other units citywide. And again, that's not an affordable housing element of that. That's the 12-year multifamily tax exemption. That's the affordable housing requirement. And we stacked that with an affordable housing impact fee abatement program at Merritt Manor. And I think what's really exciting as a model for us citywide and maybe countywide for that is that means that there's a requirement at that apartment building that for the next 20 years, rents will be at or below 80% of area median income. And during that period, we'll continue to monitor annually that apartment building to make sure that rents stay at that rate. That project is specifically designed for families. So many of the families who have found units there have also experienced homelessness. So it's been a really great resource for us in the community so far. And because of the incentives, like the impact fee abatement and the tax credit or the tax exemption, the city hasn't had to invest any other cash into the project like we're doing at other sites. So the benefits, what we buy, what we get out of that is the exchanges, the exemptions and those other things. That's all we have to invest. We don't have to add funds to that model.
So we did get a fair number of questions around the multifamily tax exemption credits. Is there a place where someone could go to learn more about either the provisions under the statute or the City of Olympia's program specifically?
No, you're muted, Carrie.
I could provide more information on both the state program and our program.
Okay, maybe that's something we can include in the FAQ. That would be great.
Can I just add one thing, Joyce, real quickly? I just wanted to add that the multifamily tax exemption doesn't give the developer any money directly. What it does is it exempts a portion of the assessed value of the property tax for the period, either it's 8 years or 12 years.
Okay, great, thank you. Here's a great question. Are there any opportunities for disabled or low-income individuals to get into home ownership and help with down payments?
There are, yes, and there's not enough. So there are in our community, an organization that's been doing a lot of home ownership work, especially for households with lower incomes, is Habitat for Humanity. They've done projects in Olympia, Tumwater, and Lacey, and hopefully there's more space for more of that sort of work in the future.
Great. What kind of opportunities exist for converting empty commercial spaces around town into housing? And are there any state or federal grants available to help make that happen?
That's a really good question. The Housing Action Plan does talk about that a little bit. We've talked about that internally quite a bit. We do have one example of a commercial building, an office building near the Capitol campus that in the last few years that has been converted to residential very successfully. I expect that we will see more given the direction of the markets of commercial, both retail and office. The need for those might be maybe less over the coming years. And certainly we know the demand for residential is very high. We have in our development regulations tried to make those as clear as we can so that it's that there's that clarity and certainty for developers who might want to do that. And we're hoping that we do see more of that, particularly in those transit corridors and high density neighborhoods that Amy showed on the map on the slide earlier in her presentation.
And I hear a lot of interest in the community in this. And, it's something definitely, I think, as we look at the Capitol Mall area, we want to look at, and we're going to need to engage with these property owners and developers to really assess what would it take, what opportunities can we create. And I think that's where we really want to make sure that we're not making it too complicated, complex and costly to do. If we really want to see those conversions happen, let's make it a little bit easier. We're not going to sacrifice safety, certainly. And, there may be some opportunities to, I wouldn't promise it, but we could look at, what kind of incentives there might be to help make that happen.
Great.
There's also likely to be some new funds at the state level for hotel conversion to incentivize affordable housing production. Last year, we worked with the county to survey opportunities for that around the county. And one of our challenges in Thurston County and Olympia is just we don't have a ton of hotels who are interested or willing to sell for a program like that. And commercial space is the same. I think the cost and or a willing partner is not always there. Not always easy to find.
Okay. Thank you for that. Here's a question for you, Carrie. How is the home fund being used to address homelessness?
So right now, the home fund is, we are, next week, the home fund advisory group met and is bringing recommendations to council for their third year of funding recommendations. And in these first 3 years, they've been really focused on helping fund affordable housing, specifically for households that have experienced homelessness. During Amy's presentation, she mentioned the 2828 Martin Way project. That's focused on single adults who have experienced homelessness, and there's supportive housing on site, or supportive services on site for those folks. The second year, we awarded funds to help Family Support Center build apartments on the west side, mostly for families who have experienced homelessness. And so that's been so far providing supportive housing for households that are homeless has been a focus of the home fund to date. And so right now, the home fund's goal is to fund 300 units in its first 5 years of supportive housing. And Amy mentioned, really, the home fund is just the seed money. Generally, if we're contributing $1 million for an apartment building that's going to serve 60 or so households, the total construction cost is often around $18 to $20 million.
Great, thank you. And actually, one of the follow-up questions is, will low-income housing be cheaply made?
Well, so that's a great question, because it's really different because of the many types of money that are layered into an affordable housing project. Those different types of funds and fund sources, city and state and federal funders have different requirements, and sometimes those requirements add costs up front. One of the things that our state Housing Finance Commission and Department of Commerce have is an evergreen standard, which is, it's kind of like LEED for affordable housing. So it's a sustainability standard that wants to make sure that the units are energy efficient, that their water use is efficient, that they're oriented to transit, so that costs aren't passed on to the households living in the affordable housing over time.
Great, thank you. Leonard, did you have anything you wanted to add? I couldn't tell.
Well, just it's somewhat related, not directly on point, but I did want to mention that in the past and potentially in the future, our community development block grant program has funded renovations for existing housing for energy retrofits, like what Carrie was mentioning, or other needs to do just the same thing for existing housing and people who are in existing housing. And this goes back to the question around people who perhaps are on fixed incomes, is many people are in their same home and want to stay. And as Amy mentioned, age in place, so to speak, maybe stay in their same house. And so a program like this, which is also mentioned in the Housing Action Plan, could help assist people with those renovations that might be needed to keep it energy efficient, keep it safer, address things that are maybe deteriorated a little bit in an older home, and keep that as a quality residence for that person or someone else of a little bit lower income level. So that's another program we're looking at.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Leonard. Just shout out to Community Action Council, manages some programs like that for renters, and Habitat for Humanity manages some programs like that for homeowners.
Great, thank you. So here's a question, and they're talking about exemptions. I'm not sure if they're talking about impact fee exemptions or multifamily tax exemptions, but it says it's basically asking if there's a difference for large builders or in comparison to small builders. Does that matter when it comes to the exemptions?
In order to qualify for there's a number of things that you need to do in order to qualify and cannot do in order to qualify for the multifamily tax exemption. You need to be building or rehabbing 4 or more units. And another requirement is you cannot displace residential tenants when you're doing that. If you are, then you wouldn't qualify for rehab or new construction.
Okay, good. Still looking for a question around why fire sprinklers are a requirement in the city.
I'll take a shot at that one. I mean, certainly there's the very obvious ones, which is safety. There's overwhelming evidence that that sprinkler buildings and structures, particularly residences where people are sleeping, are much less likely to result in death or as serious of property damage as non-sprinkler buildings. I mean, that's the main reason. The City of Olympia has required that now for a number of years, and a few other jurisdictions in the state are doing the same. I will say that depending on the type of water service that is available to the building or the residence or the vacant property, if it's new construction, the cost of adding a sprinkler system in new construction is actually a very small proportion of the overall construction costs. Retrofitting existing buildings, it can be a little bit greater proportion. And in recognition of that, our city council recently, in updating our building codes, looked at that and reduced or changed the requirements for whether an accessory dwelling unit that's being added to an existing home is required to sprinkler. So if the existing home is not already sprinklered, if it's an older structure that was built prior to the sprinkler requirements, then a new ADU added to that accessory dwelling unit added to that property would not be required to have a sprinklers. Only if the existing main home is already sprinklered would that accessory dwelling unit be required to have that sprinklers. And that's recognizing that additional water service and adding that would add to that cost pretty significantly for that ADU. So that's one thing we have done regarding affordability of housing related to sprinkler requirements.
Okay, great, thank you. And we still have over 30 questions, so I'm going to try to kind of keep scrolling through these and asking them. So are developers in Olympia using the 12-year exemption, or are they primarily only using the 8-year exemption and not having a requirement for affordable housing?
Yeah, one 12-year multifamily tax exemption project in Olympia. It's called Merritt Manor, and it's on Martin Way. And they qualified for a multifamily tax exemption. They also used the impact fee abatement program, the affordable housing impact fee abatement. So, and that added a longer period of affordability. So it stretched it from 12 years to 20 years. And it also added the requirement that all households during that entire 20 years are at or below 80% of area median income. So it's really exciting. I'd love for us to get more of those going.
Okay. Here's an interesting question. It says low income rental units are tied to AMI, area median income, which will continue to increase year after year, but wages are not going to rise at nearly the same level. And the affordability gap will continue to get wider. Is the city doing anything to take a look at that or to plan for that type of issue over time?
I think we recognize that that's the case and that wages are certainly part of the affordability issue. In this project, when we were talking about this with Lacey and Tumwater, we recognized that. We wanted to include that recognition in the plan, but we didn't have the right stakeholders at the table to make any recommendations about wages. That could be something that's looked at on a regional level. I think that's a really hard issue to crack, and I don't know that there's other than wage increases keeping up with the cost of housing. I'm not sure at this point what we can do about that widening gap.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, a lot of this work is what on the housing side, as far as housing supply and diversifying types of housing and growing our affordable housing toolbox. I mean, I think that that's part of what this effort is focused on.
I would just add to it, and it isn't directly part of this project, but the city's economic development strategy has focused very heavily on the data we have in Olympia regarding incomes and wages not keeping up with costs, and how can we work with job training programs and other things to help people into fields that do provide a little higher wages. Also working with really promoting local businesses, which do tend to maybe have those wages a little more tied to local costs as opposed to corporate entities, which may be looking at more national trends, recognizing that costs in Washington State, or at least in Western Washington, are a little higher than they are in other parts of the country. And so, you know, national companies sometimes base their wages on those lower cost areas where some of their employees live. So, you know, there are things we are doing through our economic development side that I think are really focused in that direction. But as both Amy and Carrie said, this is one of the most difficult problems we face, because it's such a comprehensive issue that it goes way beyond just our city boundaries. But we are certainly trying to address it in some ways as we can.
Great. And so this question's rather long. I'm going to try to just kind of pull out a little piece of it. But what might the city do to help existing landlords who are offering affordable housing? Like perhaps they have a rental or two and they're trying to keep the rent below market rate. Are there any opportunities that would help that type of a landlord or property owner? Someone that may not qualify for the multifamily tax exemption or may not be in the boundary within that exemption.
Sure, because they're an existing, well, the state has a program. So right now the city doesn't have a program or a service related to that, although some cities do. So this is part of what our plan explores, is what are those tools and what could we add? You know, another program that the state has that some cities have are what our state calls a landlord mitigation program. So that provides support and options for landlords who are renting to folks who are receiving some sort of public subsidy or assistance, like a rent voucher from the housing authority. So it helps provide some additional insurance and incentives for landlords to continue to rent to tenants who are receiving some sort of public support. By helping, if there are damage, it'll help pay for some of those damages or arrears or other things like that.
Great. And then a follow-up to the second half of the question has to do with, are there any opportunities to use some sort of tax credit or tax exemption of some sort for people who would be willing to build accessory dwelling units, because those are almost always smaller and more affordable kinds of rental housing.
I think there could be some opportunity there. I think I don't know of any program now that does that. I know that the city of Portland had a pilot program where they provided a subsidy for people who had accessory dwelling units who are willing to either rent that at a very low level or provide it even free for people who are experiencing homelessness. I don't know if that program is continuing to date, but it had been a pilot that had been in place. So those are things I think that also could be explored under the Housing Action Plan and as we move forward in the future, because there's definitely some options there for the city.
We have a comment or a question that over the next 25 years, 1 out of 2 new households will likely be low income. How is that strictly defined by annual earnings under the specific thresholds, or is it defined as anyone who spends more than 30% of their income on housing? Or how is low income defined?
Yeah, so that is a projection that was done by Thurston Regional Planning Council. It's based on projection of incomes, based on job trends. There's a lot of assumptions built into that, such as, we think that retail might diminish, warehousing might, get a little bit larger and those kind of things. So it's projected the types of jobs that people will have and the incomes that are projected, based on current trends for those incomes at those jobs, what they'll look like.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Leonard, did you want to add something there?
Well, I'll just throw out a point that I think we haven't yet covered in some of that data, and that is people either in retirement or moving to the area from who have a job somewhere else. It might be moving to Olympia because they want to live here and work elsewhere, either remotely or in some other way. And so there's some things we need to dig into on that a lot more around that, because it is based on specifically on jobs that are available here in this county, and sort of assumes that people living here are also working here. And that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, we do have some data on some pretty detailed data on how many people are commuting in and out of the county and how many people are retired or not working and are living in the county. So there's quite a bit more we need to do there, but it is an eye-opening statistic when you look just at people who are jobs that are available here and the likely incomes of those jobs. So we do have a lot of work to do.
Thanks for adding that, Leonard. Definitely, and it is just a projection. And so that's one of the reasons why we want to be continually monitoring this data, because sometimes trends change. And we know that with COVID, work from home rules have been lifted, and there really may be some significant trend changes to where people live in association to their job. And so we will be tracking that as part of digging that into that more.
Great. And actually, I have 2 questions that came in from separate individuals, but I'm going to kind of pose them at the same time. So the first one is, how are we doing at providing the units we need to meet our population growth and our changing demographics? And then the second one is like, this is really great groundwork for the future, but we have such an incredible need today. Will this be aggressively pursued, and how will that happen? So I think those are both kind of interesting questions that pair well together.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've taken some significant steps in the past few years, and it's certainly our intention as a city to continue to grow our efforts. We are limited somewhat, particularly in the resource area. A lot of this does depend on our ability to, assist our partners in building low-income housing, and our resources for doing that are really limited. I mentioned this countywide home fund. I think that could be somewhat of a more aggressive move that we could take as a region to help us do more. It does. I think we can make a difference, but as I also mentioned, this is going to take action across the whole industry, and it can feel daunting to think about the difference between where we are and where we need to be to meet our housing needs. The other part of the question was, how well are we doing? I think, we've seen some low-income housing projects, built with Billy Frank Jr., Merritt Manor, 2828 Martin Way, and initiated in the past few years that, maybe accelerated things a little bit from the past. But yeah, it would be good if we could double, triple, quadruple those efforts as a region.
So Anybody else want to add anything before I pose the next question?
Well, I think Joyce, I just add that like we all acknowledge like the this will be a long process, and the headwinds are really strong, right? So it's really hard to talk about affordable housing and in homelessness in the context of our current challenges, which are really significant. And so as we're making changes, or when we're helping fund a project that's getting 60 folks housed at a time, but we still know our point in time count is hovering around 1,000 folks. That's daunting, but we still need to keep making that progress and hope that other systemic things, like Social Security, will also start to change too. We have folks in our community who are making, $8,000, $9,000, $1,000 a month on Social Security or other disability payments, and that's obviously not enough when rent for a studio apartment is around $1,000 or more.
Okay, thank you. So I've had a couple of questions about tiny houses and tiny houses on wheels. Do you see that as being an option that the city can or will consider more?
Yes, we are. Sorry, Amy. I'm sure you'll have more to add to what I have to say. Right now, we do not define tiny houses per se in our code, but actually just they're treated as houses. If someone wants to construct a home that's very small, that is allowed, and that can be as an accessory dwelling unit, or it can be a standalone unit, or in some cases could even be a cluster of housing on one piece of property. So we have all those options available in the city at this point. I will clarify, when people talk about tiny houses on wheels, if they're actually constructed on a trailer to be a mobile unit that can be moved around easily and stays on the wheels, that's actually classified by the state as a recreational vehicle and is regulated under state labor and industries. So that's something that is considered temporary housing. But if it's actually permanently affixed to a foundation or to, on a piece of property, then that is certainly allowed in the city. And as Amy mentioned during her presentation, we have a number of things in place to encourage that, such as pre-approved accessory dwelling unit plans and other things. Some of those plans go as low as 400 square feet. So those are available at our permit counter now. And if someone's interested, they can certainly contact us to get started on that. Pre-approval means that our building plan reviewers have already reviewed them. There would not be a cost for the time needed for additional review if those are built according to the plans we have available that a local architect designed. So, and Amy, I know you had things to add probably.
I think you covered it, and we're at 6:30 now, so we did tell people that this would end about 6:30.
Sorry. So
can I just point out really quick, Amy, there's a whole nother body of work that the city is involved with that's more micro houses, or it's small units or shelters for folks, many of whom have experienced homelessness. Those aren't necessarily considered housing, but that's a whole different body of work and outside of this plan, but that the city has been involved with.
And I just wanted to note that I apologize. I thought this was going until 7, not 6:30. So, but we still have close to 30 questions in the Q&A. So we will keep these questions and work on responding to these questions and issuing an FAQ on the Engage Olympia site.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everyone for asking really good questions. As Joyce said, we'll post an FAQ, but if you want to talk to me, or any of us, feel free, go on Engage Olympia. You can see my contact information, contact me. I'm happy to talk about your questions or just about your thoughts about our housing actions. It's a really important part of helping us develop the right approach for the city of Olympia. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate your engagement, and have a wonderful evening.
Thanks for bringing us together, Amy.
Thank you so much, you guys. Great job. Really good job answering the questions, and appreciate you a lot. And Joyce and Ken and Anna, thank you.